let's start. Since I arrived here, I do get a feeling there is a lot here to talk about Taiwan recently.
Yeah.
For example, the Xinhua news agency, right, government agency, the past few days they were like continuously articles about Taiwan issue, which is highly unusual. So, just to give you an example, one article, the title is "The Origin and the Nature of the Taiwan Issue." The other one, "The Development, Cross-Strait Relations and Unification are Beneficial." And then there's another one, "The Inevitable Unification of the Motherland." So it just seems like a lot of articles that they have been talking about the Taiwan issue. And then there are a few other things happened. One is some pretty influential, famous social media person from Taiwan. He visited China. He used to be a hardcore pro-independent separatist kind of a person. But after that visit, he totally changed. He went back to Taiwan and said, the DPP, the ruling party, has been lying to us. Not surprising, because lots of people in
What a
Taiwan,
surprise.
lots of people in Taiwan thought the mainland is way behind Taiwan in development. But of course, what he thought was totally the opposite. So he was very angry with the DPP. And so that, it seems like it had a lot of effect, in particular on young people. And then follow that with the election of the KMT, the opposition national party. They had a chair election, and the person, a woman, Zheng Liwen, who was elected, she actually made it very clear during her election. She said, one thing I do want to achieve is I want everybody living in Taiwan to be proud of being a Chinese. Now, that kind of a platform or rhetoric was not unheard of, and she won with big margins. So even though that's not general election, but it tells you that there is some opinion shifting in Taiwan as well. And there's also the Rand Corporation has this talking about stabilizing the U.S.-China rivalry, which is the whole tone of that article is much softer than you used to. And in there, it mentioned Taiwan, saying stabilizing the Taiwan issue should focusing on creating the maximum incentive for Beijing to pursue gradual approaches towards unification. Now, that I haven't heard at all in the past, because it's always about we're going to defend Taiwan, protect Taiwan, all that kind of. So, what is your take on all this?
Right, I'm going to say a few things. A lot of points you've made here, very many points here. Now, I'm going to make a guess, and this is perhaps drawn more from my experience of following Russian media than Chinese media, and I accept Chinese media may work in a different way. But in Russia, if you see official or semi-official media bringing up repeatedly a specific topic on the eve of a leaders' meeting, that is a clear sign that the Russians intend to bring that topic up over the course of the forthcoming leaders' meeting. So if the Chinese media works in a similar way, and I want to stress, I don't know that it does, but it would not surprise me if it did. I wonder whether what is partly happening here is that the Chinese media are bringing this topic up now in the way that they are in preparation for the fact, and are actually alerting the Americans to the fact that Xi Jinping does expect to discuss the Taiwan situation with Donald Trump when they meet. I think very soon now. So that I think is partly what this is about, and I think the Chinese want to make it absolutely clear to the Americans this is absolutely not negotiable for China. It's impossible. China cannot negotiate on this. That there is a clear Chinese red line on this issue. That China obviously is not looking for a war. It is looking for a peaceful unification with Taiwan. It's looking for ultimately good relations with the United States as it seeks good relations with all countries. But that if Donald Trump is, or some of the very terrible people who surround him, have this idea that they can play a game with China over Taiwan, then they are very much mistaken. Now, Trump, we're probably anticipating, but jumping a bit ahead here, but Trump, it seems to me, has given very significant ground over the trade issues with the discussions with China. I mean, he's clearly looking to patch things up with China. I think he's understood behind all the rhetoric and the brave words and the threats and the insults and all of that, that he really doesn't have any strong cards against China at all. And I think the Americans have been badly spooked by the whole rare earths business. And I sent you those comments that Bessent had made, and how the Chinese foreign ministry basically, as far as I can see, squashed them. China's not giving an inch on this. So I think that the Americans don't want to find themselves in a direct confrontation with China now. But what the Chinese are going to say is, look, you don't want to get into a confrontation with us, and you can't afford it. We can. We agree. We too don't want to get into a confrontation with you. We have a win-win relationship. We want a win-win relationship, which is what China says. We should act responsibly as two great nations. The whole peace in the world depends on us managing our relationship well. And that's, by the way, something that Chinese officials always say. I'm confident that Xi Jinping is going to explain it for the umpteenth time to the Americans, to Donald Trump this time. But what the Chinese want to make absolutely clear is that, yes, we can move forward, we can settle issues with trade, we can discuss all kinds of things. We're happy to talk with you. And we understand that sometimes there has to be some give and take on some issues. So, yes, we will buy some more of your soybeans, but don't for one moment, don't for 1 second think that on Taiwan, China's position is not what China says it is. So that, I think, is probably what these media reports are saying. Now, if I can just I'll just touch on Taiwan itself. I mean, I go back to that article that I sent you a few months ago in the Financial Times about the alarm and horror in Taiwan and in parts of the West, that young people in Taiwan were taking an interest in what's going on in the mainland and discovering that life there was actually pretty good and things of that kind. It is good. I said to you, I went to Shanghai in 2017, which is, quite a few years ago. You could see that this was a very technologically advanced modern country. Any idea that China is some sort of backward, primitive place inhabited by millions of peasants, which is what the West, not that there's anything wrong with peasants, by the way, but in the West's imagination there always is. All of that is absolute nonsense. The whole point about that article in the Financial Times is you can see that the propaganda story is being promoted very heavily in Taiwan itself, that China is this backward, primitive, cruel place. And of course, what was really frightening to the Taiwanese authorities, I call them that, the people who are in control in the island of Taiwan at this time, and their Western backers, who include the Financial Times, is that, of course, they don't want to allow any cracks in that story to appear. And for young people in Taiwan, especially, to understand that everything that they've been told about this great nation, of which, as this lady from the Kuomintang has correctly said, they are a part, that everything that they've been told about it is false. So this is probably what this person has discovered. He's just been to China, to the mainland, and he's seen it for himself, and it will have an effect. Now, if I can come to the Rand Corporation report, Rand is very important. Rand is the ultimate American think tank. It's the great analytical center. It provides foreign policy analysis for the US government. And the fact that it is publishing a report like this, which is basically telling the administration, look, confrontation with China absolutely does not serve America's interests. We've got to find a means to live and work with China and to have a stable relationship with China. And we've got to find some way to put the problem of Taiwan to one side. And all this talk about defending Taiwan that we used to get from Joe Biden really is unhelpful and must be dropped, and is leading us into a confrontation which we cannot win. I mean, there's no, whoever wins from that confrontation, if anybody does, it won't be the United States. Now, that is important, and it shows to us that there are sensible and rational people within the US foreign policy establishment who do understand and have some understanding of the need to change policy towards China. And Rand is known to be very closely connected to the Council for Foreign Relations. Mm-hmm. And that's, the most prestigious group of people in the United States who discuss foreign policy. So this is not to be disregarded, and it is very important. Now, but I have to add a word of warning here, because about 2 years ago, Rand, this is after the start of the Ukraine war, Rand began to publish a whole series of articles about the US relationship with Russia as well. And it made many of the same points that we're reading in this article about China, that the United States does not benefit from a long drawn out confrontation with Russia, that the conflict in Ukraine, its outcome is not, but the prospect is that if it is extended, it will become more dangerous for the United States, and the outcomes could be very bad for the United States. And there were several articles that appeared in Rand, and which, as it turned out, were backed by people in the Council of Foreign Relations, in particular a very important figure within it called Thomas Graham, who is universally regarded as one of the great thinkers on American foreign policy. Anyway, those articles advocated steps to improve relations with Russia. It never happened. I mean, the forces that desire have consistently proved stronger, including under Trump, just as they did under Biden. So an article, a report maybe, call it a report rather than an article in Rand, cannot be ignored or disregarded. But one shouldn't take it to the bank and say to oneself, this definitely means that American policy is going to change.
But just thinking from the US perspective, now if Trump wants to play the card, Taiwan is a card that is an important card, but if he wants to play it, I think he needs to play it as soon as possible, meaning he made a promise, a commitment to the Chinese government saying, the United States is going to stay out of it. You do what you need to do. Okay, we will stay out of it. That is something very much I think that China would want to hear, welcome. And in return, he might get something. I think it's possible he gets something, rare earth, soybean, what have you. He can ask something in return. But the longer he's not doing that, it's become less and less relevant for the United States to say, I stay out of it. It will come to a point, whether the United States stay out of it or not, China no longer cares. At that point, that card doesn't mean much anymore. I don't even think it's a card anymore. So for that reason, I think it serves the United States best to bring up the Taiwan issue and make it clear.
Yeah,
we're not doing anything. Just do what you want. We will stay out of it. Don't you think?
You are absolutely correct. Again, that is the rational approach that the United States should follow. And yes, I think if the United States were to act in the way that you say, if Donald Trump acted in the way that you've described, I think that would take a lot of the tension out of the relationship between China and the United States. China would indeed give things in return over soybeans, over access to rare earths, because ultimately, why wouldn't it? I mean, why would China not do that? So yes, there is there on the table. Now, there are problems, however, and this is, I'm going to go back to the Russian things, because these are the ones I know. Now, the Russians have now provided us, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has provided us with a very detailed account of the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska, in Anchorage. And it is one that people in China, including the government of China, should be fully aware of. Xi Jinping himself and Wang Yi know all about this, because after Anchorage, Putin telephoned Xi Jinping and briefed him in detail about the discussions which took place in Anchorage. But anyway, what happened was this. In the lead up, at the beginning of August, Trump sent Steve Witkoff, his envoy, to, and Witkoff came with a proposal to end the Ukraine war, which he delivered to Putin. Now, we don't know all of the details of this proposal, but we know two things, because the Russians have confirmed one, and there's been lots of media commentary about the other. One was that Ukraine will not become part of NATO ever, that issue is resolved once and for all. The second is that in return for the Ukrainian army withdrawing from Donbass, or the two Lugansk region, the Russians would be willing to show more flexibility on other territorial issues and would stop their advance in these two other regions, Zaporozhye and Kherson. So that was the proposal Witkoff brought to Putin in Moscow. Witkoff told Putin, let's have a meeting with Trump, between you and Trump, in order to work this out. Putin said yes. Up to that point, he'd resisted having a meeting with Trump. They met in Anchorage. Putin then, and this is what Lavrov says, went through this proposal that Witkoff had given him, clause by clause, step by step. He said to Witkoff was there, he was sitting next to Trump. He said to Witkoff, is this correct? Is this right? Have I understood this correctly? Witkoff, in every instance, answered in the positive. And then at the end of it, Putin said to Trump, I've heard all of that. I understand that this is the agreement, that your proposal, we've discussed it in Russia. We agree. We actually agree. Agree to this proposal that you have made. And then, to the Russians' astonishment, Trump said, well, I have to go away and talk to other people in Washington, and then I will come back to you. And then he went away, and the Russians were left waiting and waiting. And they started to call, and they started to say, well, this is your proposal. What are you doing with it? And he said, well, actually, I'm prepared to go with that proposal anymore. And I want instead a freeze on the existing conflict lines, and then negotiations about all of those other things, including NATO. And in the meantime, I'm thinking of sending Tomahawks to Ukraine, and I'm going to sanction your oil companies just for the best. So this is why by explaining all of this in China, that you can get a meeting with Trump in which he will agree to all of these things. He will say to you, absolutely, I entirely agree. Taiwan is part of China. You can do what you like. You can sort it out all by yourselves. And in return, China agrees to buy more soybeans and to relax exports of rare earths. And then the moment you do that, Trump goes back to Washington and he reverses his position. So China needs to be very, very careful. We have an expression in England: he who sups with the devil needs a very long spoon. You have to have everything clearly set down and set out in writing. What the Russians didn't do with the meeting in Anchorage, I think the Chinese need to be very, very careful. I'm sure Xi Jinping and Wang Yi will be, because they know about what happened in Anchorage. And if you have that kind of definite proposal from Trump, at the very least, you must insist that he's going to set it out, make it public. He's got to go out, tell the cameras, tell the people in Congress, Taiwan is China's problem. It is not the problem of the United States. And at that point, then you could start to really move forward with the more substantive trade issues, the trade issues, the concessions that we were talking about.
I'm surprised they are not more openly angry with this whole thing. It sounds to me like I would be. I mean, it's extremely frustrated. It's just
the Russians are furious. The Russians, when they're angry, they're furious in their own way. And again, it's not always easy to read the signals. I mean, I'll give you one example. Putin gave a press conference in which, for the first time, he avoided mentioning Trump's name.
Okay.
He referred all the time to the president of the United States. He went out of his way to calling him Trump, and certainly he didn't call him Donald or anything of that kind. So that, if you know the Russian style, is a sign of very strong anger. But you're absolutely right, and I'm sure, by the way, that there is this constant contact between Beijing and Moscow. And I think that Xi Jinping will be fully briefed about all of this. I get the sense that Xi Jinping never goes into meetings without massive preparation. The problem with Alaska is it was not prepared properly in advance. There should have been at least, proper meetings like there was between Bessent and He, preparing for this meeting with Xi Jinping. There should have been something of that kind. And the Russians made the mistake of not doing it. I don't believe the Chinese will do the same.
Since we're talking about Russia, one of the things, when I was reading a book, Annie Jacobson's book called The Nuclear War, A Scenario. Now, it's a fiction, of course. It's a made-up story. But in there is one question I had. Now, what the scenario was, in the book, is that North Korea started sending a nuclear bomb to the United States, dropped a nuclear bomb. And in return, of course, immediately the United States need to retaliate. Okay. But the way they're doing that is sending a intercontinental ballistic missile carrying a nuclear bomb going to North Korea. It's going to go over the Russian airspace. So they want to contact Russia to explain to them this is not going to drop on your country. It's passing there. If this were a real scenario, if I were the Russian president, now in the book they never ever contacted, even find the Russian president, because the Russian didn't even want to conversation this. Anyway, so but if let's say that this was what happened, if anybody were in Putin's position, why would he trust that this will only pass through Russia? How can, right?
Impossible. I mean, it's out of the question. I mean, this is again. You're absolutely. This is a fantasy thing. Difficult to imagine, by the way, North Korea, for some unknown reason, launching an attack on the United States. I mean, there would have to be a massive buildup of tension, and there'd be all kinds of reasons for it, and we would have a lot of diplomatic action and all of that before we got there. But let's assume we were in that kind of catastrophic scenario. As you absolutely rightly say, trust has completely gone. There is no trust between the Russians and the Americans anymore. I don't myself think it's possible. I don't myself believe that Putin can meet Trump again. It is, again, the Russians have made it very clear that the Budapest summit meeting was again proposed by Trump. Putin never formally agreed to it.
Mm-hmm.
There were discussions about it, but this time the Russians were insisting that there had to be much more careful preparation than there was ahead of the summit meeting in Alaska. And that's why Trump basically called it off. So there is no trust. I don't think there's much trust, and I have to say this, between China and the United States either. I think the Chinese, careful people that they are, will want everything set out clearly. They will want there to be no ambiguities in any place at all.
Well, like I just saw that China confirmed this. Trump has talked about it for a while now that he's going to have a meeting, but China waited pretty late to confirm that. I think for that reason, because I don't think that they're confident that this will be a good idea until very last minute, like, right? So it shows that there is no trust. All right, that just
no. Exactly.
But before we,
I mean, normally, when two leaders like Trump and Xi agree to meet, the thing is announced simultaneously.
Yeah.
What Trump, he did this with the Budapest summit and he did this with the Alaska summit. He announced it first before the other side had agreed. And of course, we saw what happened in Alaska. And he did the same with China about the meeting with Xi Jinping. He announced it first and made it appear as if the summit meeting had already been agreed, when I am sure it had not been. I think that the Chinese wanted the meetings to happen between her and Bessent before they agreed to the meeting, and they wanted to see where it was all going. Now that there's been the reports brought back to Beijing, and now that it's been discussed there, China is able to confirm the meeting. But they're going to go into the meeting very, very thoroughly prepared. They'll have every point ready, and we'll see how the meeting goes.
Yeah, and then I just feel right now you can't trust anything the U.S. officials say. Right? Bessent claimed that China agreed to postpone this rare earth mineral control for a year. In return, the U.S. would drop this 100% tariffs. And of course, you send me that link, right? That the Chinese spokesperson, the foreign ministry spokesperson, pretty much denied, any of those things. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that's what they agreed to. But Bessent just went out to say that, which is again lie. But I guess they do that all the time, right? They just get ahead of themselves and claim that they have some kind of victory in a way, and then waiting for kind of like force it upon China or something, right?
Well, absolutely. They do. You're absolutely right. They do this all the time. They constantly oversell, overpromote the breakthroughs that they're supposed to be achieving. I mean, we see the Gaza ceasefire already been breaking down. They do this all the time. But of course, there is a sinister side to this, because what they're trying to do is that they're trying to shape they announced that there's a meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping going to happen before the Chinese have agreed. But that puts pressure, that's intended to put pressure on the Chinese to agree. They announced that China has to agree to delay Earth's regulations for a whole year. Probably that's something the Americans want to discuss, but by implying that the Chinese have already agreed to it. You could see that. I mean, it's the sort of thing that, by the way, it's not just Trump who behaves. This is the point I want to make. It's not just like this. I've had many dealings with the Americans many times. American companies, American businesses have had to experience many times away from a meeting. You've agreed on a few points. They come back and they imply you've agreed on every point. And, and they then go around phoning up everybody and telling everybody, look, we've made the breakthrough. We've agreed on all the big points. And then that puts you in a very difficult position, or potentially a very difficult position. I got used to it, so I was no longer embarrassed by it anymore. But in which you have to deny that what the Americans are saying is true. But it is very much the style of negotiations that the Americans like to engage in. And it's actually deeply frustrating. And I could see that it works within the United States, over real estate deals or Wall Street deals or whatever, but it doesn't work with China. And I think that's a thing that Americans find very difficult to get.
Well, I don't think even working in the United States. In the Empire of AI, this book, apparently Sam Altman is like that. He would talk to different board members for different issues, and then he would announce that they agreed that, which they didn't. And that's what angered the board members. So he would tell one board member saying so and so already agreed on this one, and then he would tell somebody else, oh, we agreed, blah blah. And then the board members, they got meeting, get together themselves, they realized this is not what happened. That's why he was briefly, remember, the board briefly fired him. That's the reason that he just constantly make up stories about the board members what they agreed to.
It's been done to me. I mean, as I said, I don't know how people in America learn to do this, but it's something that is very typical of American business. I haven't actually had any direct dealings with Chinese companies, but I'm sure that they do not work in this way. I cannot imagine that they do. I'm sure from everything I've heard from other people, from the things the Russians say, they're extremely careful. They go through everything bit by bit, point by point. They're totally straightforward. And sometimes they can be in private, they can be very, very direct, apparently. I mean, Chinese are famously polite people, but that doesn't mean that, if they have to, they won't be direct and to the point as well. So it's a completely different understanding.
Yeah. Sometimes the Chinese people can be very straightforward, very direct. For example, I mean, people would say, "Oh, I haven't seen you for a while. You gained some weight." People would say that. Very straightforward.
Yes. I've heard. I remember my brother-in-law has lived in China for many years, and he's living in Hong Kong at the moment. But I mean, he said this to me many, many times. That yes, they're very polite, but they're also very straightforward and very direct as well.
To to lose some weight or something like that, which we would never say that in the West. Yeah. Yes. Okay, before we get into this whole detail about Trump's trip and the upcoming meeting, can you explain a little bit about the Plaza Accord happened in 1985? Because it is a little bit similar circumstances, right? That there was a huge deficit the U.S. feel not comfortable with, so they negotiated with multiple countries. Can you explain the background and what they achieved?
Yes, the key country, of course, was Japan, though other Asian countries, especially of that time, were involved. So the United States, in some respects, was in a somewhat similar situation to the one that it is in today, in that there was concerns that the American economy, which relative to the rest of the world, of course, in 1985 was much, much bigger than it is now. And America had a much, much bigger share of world manufacturing and industrial production. But anyway, there was a certain worry at that time, a widespread worry, actually. America was starting to fall behind. There was concerns that Japan running an increasingly large trade surplus with the United States, that the Japanese economy had been growing very fast from the 1950s and was, well, not perhaps quite approaching America's in size, but was becoming uncomfortably big from an American point of view. And importantly, that Japan was starting to pull ahead of the United States in certain areas of technology, including, by the way, this will surprise people, we're talking about 1985, though, semiconductors. That Japan at that time, believe it or not, had quite a substantial industry in this field. So the Americans did all the things that we see today. They said that they basically threatened restrictions on Japanese imports. They started to put all sorts of political pressures. Of course, Japan being an ally of the United States, there were many political leaders in Japan who were anyway deeply receptive to American pressures. That is something which is different today. I mean, today that exists far less. So they met in the Plaza Hotel in New York. Plaza Hotel, famous hotel in New York, doesn't exist as a hotel anymore, I believe. It's been into apartment buildings, but never mind. Apartment building, never mind. Anyway, they all met, and basically the deal was done. And the deal was that Japan would open up its economy to American finance, so that American money could start to become involved, that there would be lifting of restrictions on American investments in Japan, in America's ability to buy stocks in Japanese financial institutions. That was mainly one of the major factors in it. And of course, the other thing was that Japan would allow its currency to appreciate against the dollar, so that there was widespread claims, are probably true, that Japan was managing its currency in order to remain competitive, and Japan was expected to end that, and as I said, to open up its economy. The Americans always like to say, open up your economy.
Yeah.
This is the other thing. And move it towards a more consumption-based model. I mean, it's exactly the same rhetoric that you hear today. Anyway, they did all of that. So that was Japan basically capitulated. It agreed to all of that. And the immediate result was an absolute runaway money poured into from the United States and around the world. And as financial controls in Japan were lifted, and as planning controls in Japan were basically done away with. So there was a massive real estate boom that diverted investment away from the productive part of the economy, manufacturing, into real estate. The yen rose, the stock market rose, the Japanese trade surplus with the United States fell. It all, of course, ended in a crash. The crash left a massive pile of debt. But by this point, the changes that were done to Japan's economy were so extensive that it was impossible to go back to the earlier model. And Japan has been basically stagnating ever since. So it destroyed the whole industrial investment boom that Japan had successfully achieved in the period after the Second World War. And one of the effects is that in industry after industry, where Japan had a position of enormous strength and even leadership, shipbuilding, semiconductors, those sort of things, Japan today is the force that it once was. I know that in China, the story of the Plaza Accord is very well known and very, very widely discussed, as it should be. And I read articles in the Chinese media in which people say that China must never make the same mistake that Japan did. And I don't think they will.
Well, probably that explains that currently what the United States is trying to do is to do what they did to Japan, to China, right? Basically want China to capitulate. And also explains why China cannot capitulate, because the cautionary tale is right in front of them, right? The Japanese the people called it lost decades or what have you, followed the Plaza Accord. So now that brings us to the upcoming. So first of all, Bessent and He Lifeng, they had a meeting in Malaysia. Do you think that was we don't get much information. I mean, we can't just trust what Bessent said, right? So China said it hasn't said much, so we don't know a whole lot. But what's your sense on that meeting?
Again, the Americans are overstating things. I mean, Bessent comes along. He says, it was a massively constructive meeting. Everything's gone wonderfully well. We've got the Chinese to agree to all kinds of things. I then go and look at what her said and other Chinese officials. They're far more reticent about this. From what I can tell, my own sense is that what we're probably going to see is an extension of what was basically agreed back in September in Madrid, with a few little additions. China might agree to buy a few more soybeans, things of that kind. In other words, of any real substance. And what really needs to happen, and we've discussed this in previous programs, is that if there is going to be an agreement, a proper trade agreement, it must be negotiated properly. I think that is what China was expecting after Madrid, that the United States would appoint a negotiating team, and that China would have its own negotiating team ready, and there would be a number of big rounds of negotiations, and there would be a proper structured process, and we would eventually end up, after much discussion and whatever, we would end up with a proper trade deal. From what I can understand, nothing like that is happening. And yes, China will meet, Xi Jinping will meet with Trump. Why wouldn't he? I mean, you still want to maintain contact with the US president. I think he'll be very, very careful. He will try to explain things as he always does. You go to the Chinese foreign ministry's readouts, and they look like tutorials. See, trying to educate the Americans into how to approach these things, and be an awful lot of that. And the Chinese will push very hard on Taiwan, as I've said. And I mean, when I say push very, to stress again, I mean, what they will basically say to the Americans is, stick to what you've already promised. You promised all the way back in the 1970s and ever after. I mean, that's all we are asking you to do. We're not asking you for more than that. We are talking about that which we already agreed about long ago. But I think that Xi will want to explain that to the Americans. And I doubt that we will get much more. So we will get this probably for another year, maybe, a trade pause. And a trade pause for a year, by the way, is a win for China. Because remember, it is the Americans who embarked on this tariff madness, not the Chinese. So it'll be a win for China. China can use that year to diversify its trade even further, which will, years' time, put it in an even stronger position than the one in which it's in now. It will get Trump out of the problems that he's created for himself, but it will not be the final and conclusive end to this problem. I think that, and in a year's time, I would not be surprised if we're having a similar conversation there.
Well, Trump said that U.S. is going to have a good deal with China. This is what he said, I think 2 days ago or something. So Wall Street Journal did have something. They said that, according to their source, that the U.S. would drop or at least reduce significantly the fentanyl-related tariffs for Chinese, lots of the Chinese chemicals, ingredients and stuff like that. They use this fentanyl thing to basically to charge more tariffs. I mean, the fentanyl is a U.S. problem, but Trump just always blame China.
Well, they present as a concession. Something, a concession, when in fact it's a retreat. I mean, they imposed these tariffs on a completely phony pretext. Now finding themselves under significant pressure because of the rare earths, the Nexpedia, which, by the way, are creating a crisis in the European car industry. There's talk that Volkswagen's production is now essentially at a standstill. So they've created all of these problems. And so, they're saying, buy a few soybeans and we'll reduce these tariffs and pretend to everybody that you're not exporting or you're doing more about the fentanyl thing. The fentanyl thing has nothing to do with China. I've looked into this, by the way. I've actually asked people I know who know all about this question. If you want to know where the big source of fentanyl is, it's not very far from Britain. The people who basically run it are in the Netherlands, just to say.
That's right. Yeah. Now that you're saying it. Yeah. It had
I mean, it is.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
know.
It
I
had
mean, synthetic drugs and all of
Mhm.
that, basically,
Yeah.
that's the point of origin of it. Obviously,
Yeah.
in the Latin American states, that a lot of the cartels have
Mhm.
moved heavily into this, but they've done that because they've obtained the know-how from the Dutch.
Mhm.
And the Netherlands, by the way, has a very, very well organized crime networks, and they all interconnect with each other. Anyway, I don't want to get into this. That's a sidetrack issue. The point, it has nothing to do with China. If you knew anything about Chinese history and the way the Chinese feel about the drug trafficking altogether, you would know that it is inconceivable that China, of all countries, would be involved in this sort of thing.
Well, their argument, I saw some people saying, well, because China has, its own history with the drug, it is inconceivable for them to believe China cannot do more to help the United States. You see, that's their argument.
Yeah,
What do
it
you
is their
say?
argument, and I've seen and heard that argument, and it is based on such a complete misunderstanding, such a profound failure to understand how the Chinese feel and think about these matters. That, I mean, when I hear people talking that way, I just throw up my hands in despair and say, just coming up with one reason after another to blame China for this problem.
Now, the other thing, according to Wall Street Journal, was that they're going to reduce the port fees for both sides because
Yeah,
now China also charges, U.S. not
yeah,
just the U.S. made
straight,
ships, but U.S. owned, invested companies'
yeah.
ships. So that's another thing.
And again, an American retreat. I
Yeah.
mean, again, we go back to Mr. Bessent. I mean, he talks about Li Changgang, or I can't remember his name,
Yeah.
Chinese official
Hmm.
who was deranged in some way
Yeah.
because he
Uh-huh.
brought up the fact that the Americans imposed these fees on Chinese-built ships that came to American ports. It's the Americans who started this thing. That was an outrageous thing to do. I
Yeah.
mean, that wasn't about trade. That
Mhm.
was a straightforward attack on China's shipbuilding
Mhm.
industry. Of course, the Chinese pushed back hard on it.
Mhm.
China then takes retaliatory measures. The Americans retreat, as they have to. And then again, they said, well, we come to some kind of a wonderful, good deal with the Chinese about this. So, as I said, you pretend that you've come to an agreement when in fact you're retreating. You're stepping back from that totally unacceptable thing which you previously did.
Yeah, and then one more thing is Jensen Huang of NVIDIA. He's going to South Korea as well. And he said that
Yeah.
Trump asked him to come. Maybe there's something there as well. So we will see. But it just seems like, I mean, I'm still not too confident that there will be substantial
No.
agreement. It's just.
Well, can I just say something? And
Mhm.
I'm not very confident. I'm not going to be confident again that there will be an agreement. Isn't this interesting? So he comes, he meets Trump. Trump says, "Look, you can have your company back, so that we can start getting all of these chips." What do the Dutch say? I mean, what exactly? I mean, if we get into that kind of scenario, and why else would Trump want this man in South Korea and want to meet with him if it were not
Mhm.
to say something like that?
Mhm.
I mean, this meeting is even going to happen. I mean, the Dutch are going to look total fools.
Yeah. Well, they are in a very difficult situation right now, right? What should they do? I mean, China pretty much moved on. China already started to contact some of the major automobile manufacturers saying
Yeah.
we can start negotiating the chips now. So whatever the Dutch government took the next area, that part eventually will become irrelevant. I mean,
Well, absolutely.
so
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the Dutch are in a very difficult position, which they put
mhm,
themselves in. They should have said to the Americans, "Look, this is a perfectly legal company
mhm,
trading in a legal way. It isn't any rules. This whole business about national security is a phony one, and it will not interfere in the Netherlands' trade deals and business dealings with another country, which is China and the nationals of that country. If the Netherlands had taken that position, which is a simple one, any self-respecting country would have taken, it would not be in this difficult position now.
It's Trump. I don't know. Trump is very good at first of all making up stories to create bargaining chips, right? Like the fentanyl is created out of thin air, almost like. And then regarding the chips, I guess the whole idea is for high-end chips, they banned the selling to China, and now Jensen Huang, NVIDIA is in a difficult situation because they really don't want to lose the Chinese market. That's probably part of the reason Trump trying to push for it back to China or something. That's why he was asked to go to South Korea. And then the low end, the middle tier chips now is being disrupted because of the whole Dutch government dysphoria. Yeah. So it seems like it just one debacle after another. It's just nonstop. Whatever they're trying to do.
It is. Well, it is. I mean, what Trump is a very manipulative individual. I mean, he's very manipulative. He always looks for weak points. He tries to exploit them. He doesn't ever really think these things. He doesn't in a straightforward way. Now, what you find with people like that, I've encountered in my life, by the way, I mean, that is, if you did the kind of work I used to do, you'd meet them every day. What you find with people like that is that at the beginning, they can win. But when people figure them out, which they do very, very fast, what they find is that they can't win at all anymore because nobody any longer trusts them.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest challenge for negotiating with the United States right now. I just don't think anybody trusts the United States. How do you work with somebody like that?
Well, quite exactly.
Now, going to Russia, Russia has this. I saw you and Alex were talking about this new, I guess, very powerful weapon, Burevestnik.
Yeah.
So, can you explain to my Chinese audience what that is? Why is it significant?
Yes, again, we don't know exactly all of its properties, but it is a cruise missile.
Yeah.
And it is bigger than most cruise missiles, but not hugely bigger. So it's about 1.5 times the size of a Tomahawk missile. Okay. And it looks like a Tomahawk missile. But unlike more conventional cruise missiles, which uses an ordinary aircraft engine, which is powered by conventional fossil fuels, by high octane gasoline, all that. What the Oreshnik has is that it's powered by a miniature nuclear reactor, and it is the reactor, this very small scale nuclear reactor, that is interesting. And that means that you have a cruise missile which is apparently partly stealthy. It's the Tomahawk, and it is able, because it's nuclear powered, to basically have almost unlimited range. I mean, one shouldn't say unlimited range because eventually any machine will break down, but almost unlimited range. It can attack the United States from any direction. So a missile launched from, say, Western Russia could travel across the the Baltic Sea, around the Strait, around Africa, and it could attack the United States and the Pacific. It could do that. It could do that undetected, and it apparently operates relatively close to the ground. It operates without radar, so the radar can't see it. And the other thing it can do is that in times of tension, if the Russians fear the possibility of war, they can launch these missiles. These missiles can remain in the air, circulate around the United States until they either get the order from Moscow to return or they get the order from Moscow to go in. So as a weapon system, it is extremely, extremely dangerous. And the fact that it can strike the United States from any direction, and that it can strike the United States as a stealthy cruise missile going under radar. That poses major problems for the US's air defense system, which is not really structured to address threats of that kind. It's structured to deal with ballistic missiles, not with cruise missiles. I mean, in time that will be changed, but that is the thing at the moment. Now, having said that, there are a lot of unanswered questions about this particular missile. One is about the nuclear reactor system itself. Now, one of the things that we have learned, not from the Russians, but from the Norwegians who test, is that there was no radiation discharge. And that is very interesting and very surprising. And that suggests that this is some kind of closed cycle nuclear reactor. Well, they do exist, but to have miniaturized it to this level is a major industrial and technological achievement. And it might have implications that extend beyond the military. I mean, it might be something that you could start to use this technology in the civilian economy as well. So that is interesting. And there are many unanswered questions about this, and nobody seems to know exactly how this works. Bear in mind that nuclear reactors need to be cooled. So what is the cooling system? I mean, it doesn't seem to be air cooled, because if it was air cooled, that would result in a radioactive discharge, and there doesn't seem to be one. So that's one mystery. And the other mystery is how this missile gets its guidance. I mean, that sounds, straightforward, but apparently it is not straightforward at all. There is a lot of uncertainty about that, and how exactly it maintains contact with Moscow, and what happens if it loses contact with Moscow. So lots of uncertainties about this. So I'm not going to pretend that I have all of the answers, not by any means, but technologically this is surprising. And it does seem to be a big step forward, and it does pose problems if the Russians are able to put this into serial production. It does pose problems for the United States. Now, I'm going to say something. The Russians undoubtedly are going to share this technology with China. No question about this. I mean, the Russians they need as well. So the Russians, for example, need Chinese assistance in certain types of electronically scanned radars, for example. So it's known that there is an extensive technology exchange. And it's not impossible that Chinese engineers have been involved in developing this. So, there is some speculation in the Russian media that is so.
Well, because there's so many unknown, I actually think that makes it dangerous, right? Because you don't even know what is, full capacity and what is. But one thing I think with all missiles now, there's ultrasonic, this missile, that missile, this comes like a different version of it. It seems to me two things. One is aircraft carrier is not as powerful as it used to, right? Missiles, those who are surrounding China, for example, just launch missiles. It doesn't need even fighter jets. Like, to me, like, I have very basic understanding, but it seems like all the missiles can deal with that. And then the other thing is missile can come to the United States, which United States has always been this country has advantage far away, right, from the Eurasia, right, continent. So the United States can stir lots of troubles in other places, but the United States can stay out of it. But since now these missiles can come to the United States within pretty short period of time, that is no longer the case. The United States can just count on it would never come to the United States itself, right?
This is absolutely correct. Now, can I just quickly say on the first point, I'm glad you mentioned the danger of these things. I hope I didn't give the impression that I'm pleased that this missile has been
No.
developed. I'm
No.
horrified
Mhm.
about the fact that this missile has been developed. I think it is extremely dangerous. I think it is massively destabilizing. It's going to introduce a huge amount of uncertainty, and out of uncertainty always comes fear.
Mhm.
And we are seeing weapons like this increasingly appear in a world where the United States has itself destroyed the entire structure of arms control that
Mhm.
was negotiated by the Americans and the Russians starting in the 1960s. So the last big strategic arms treaty, the START treaty, is due to expire in February.
Mhm.
There is no sign of a replacement. There is no negotiations to extend it. There are Putin offered a 1 year extension to allow time for negotiations to begin. The
Mhm.
United States has shown no interest in that. And as we've discussed anyway, the Russians now are so suspicious and mistrustful of the Americans that it's debatable whether any negotiation can get
Mhm.
underway at all. So we're getting all these very dangerous weapons starting to appear. And
Mhm.
I am horrified about this. That's the first thing to say. The second thing that you say is absolutely true. Donald Trump constantly talks up American military capabilities.
Mhm.
He says America has the best aircraft carriers, the best missiles, the
Mhm.
best submarines. Not only is that not true, if anything, the truth is on the other side. China has many more advanced systems than the United States does. And you're completely correct. Weapon systems that the United States has historically relied upon to preserve its dominance, like aircraft carriers, are
Mhm.
now desperately vulnerable. Impossible to imagine that they would survive for very long in the event that there was an open confrontation. And absolutely, the continental United States is now itself threatened
Yeah.
in ways that it has never been up to now. Now, I don't think any of this is understood fully in the United States, and
Mhm.
Trump himself doesn't understand it. One day they will understand it, and I hope that what brings them to that
Mhm.
understanding will not be some terrible disaster. But one does wonder how America will react when they finally learn that they're not impune and dominant as they used to be.
They so slow to understand these kind of important things. I wonder whether they're really incapable of understanding, refuse to understand it. I mean, this is their job. They need to know these things. They need to understand. Certainly, Trump and people around him need to like constantly remind him about this. This is, serious. But it seems like they're all very relaxed. The government is still shut down, and everybody just, I
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, are they hiding behind something or just pretend they don't know? I mean, what are they doing, these people?
Sophia, this is very characteristic of what happens in Western countries when the decline and the decay sets in. I by the way, and again, I know enough about Chinese history to know that there it's different. I mean, if you look at the fall of dynasties, these were agonizing events.
No, yeah.
I mean, I know the story of the fall of the Ming Dynasty very well. And there's a huge effort made in the last 20 years to try to reverse
Yeah.
the slide.
Mhm.
But in the West, it's otherwise. I mean, what tends to happen is that there's complacency, there's a retreat into ceremony and pomp, there's grandiose language. There's people to pretend that things are as they always were and that they can't possibly change. And usually, when that happens, that's the moment when the real problems have set in. You're quite right. A America that was alive, that wanted to face these challenges would be behaving in a completely different way
Mhm.
from the America that we see today.
But yeah.
It is something about Western culture. I've said many times that Western culture is ultimately about power and acknowledging that things are not going well is to admit that your power is in decline. And that is something that Westerners find it almost impossible to do, if only because they worry that if they admit that, then the other Westerners would act to take advantage.
And maybe that's true. We don't know. I mean, sometimes
Yeah.
the reason lots of the Western countries think China would be, once China now is so powerful that China will, some talk about, example, Australia, for example. That's because if they were that strong, they would do it. I mean, isn't that how they think, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly right. I mean, in fact, I mean, it is inconceivable to them that China won't do it because China is that strong. So that must mean that the fact that they've not done it yet is because they're playing some very clever game indeed, which we haven't yet been able to figure out. But that is absolutely the way the West thinks.
Ceasefire in Gaza, can we say it's totally collapsed because Israel bombed Gaza, killing 100 people, and Israel said, "Oh, the ceasefire is back on." So they killed some people, and then they said it's back on.
Well, I think it has collapsed. I think what now is very cynical and very brutal is that Israel announces when it suits it that the ceasefire has been broken and conducts bombing raids. And then when it suits it again, it says that the ceasefire is back in place. So, it's able to switch this thing on and whenever it wants. And that obviously is, so sooner or later, the whole thing is going to collapse.
The last thing, Venezuela, that Trump has been building up to all this, and now he's even talking about invade Columbia. I mean, is he just crazy talk, or he does have a plan to take those two countries? I mean, what's the deal here?
Who knows? I mean, Colombia has been, by the way, if you know the history of Latin America, the single most loyal ally of the United States. I mean, whatever happens in other places, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, in Cuba, in Mexico, in Venezuela, Colombia has always consistently been America's most loyal ally. And now they want to overthrow the government there too. I said this already. I mean, what lies behind this is China again. I mean, this is because remember, even the RAND study still talks about China a rival, not a partner, not a friend, not a country that we want good relations. It's about managing the rivalry, really, not about rethinking the underlying nature of your relationship with China. So China exports a lot to Latin America, which it does. Why wouldn't it? It buys a lot from Latin America. Why wouldn't it? It has good relations with the government of Venezuela. Why wouldn't it? It has friendly relations with the government of Colombia. Why wouldn't it? So this is a vast threat. It means that the Chinese are establishing themselves in Latin America. They want to drive out the United States, which is already a bizarre idea, by the way. But anyway, and therefore, we must crush the countries, Venezuela and the president of Colombia, who are showing these flickers of independence at the moment. And the fact that Maduro and I forget his name, the president of Colombia, have been fairly outspoken, makes it even more important to crush them, because that means that they have offended Trump himself, and he's determined, therefore, to put them in their place. In other words, in prison somewhere, as he sees it. And it's the same story. You make up stories about drugs. Of course, Colombia is a place that produces lots of drugs. Venezuela, by the way, isn't. And it isn't even a transit place about drugs. But, of course, Colombia is. So you talk up the subject of drugs. You assemble a massive fleet. You tell the American people a fairy tale that you're doing it to stop the drugs trade. And you impose control, and you publish, or rather you prepare big reports within the Pentagon about defending the Western Hemisphere. And we all know from whom, by the way, again, it's China. China supposedly is threatening to take over the Western Hemisphere. So the United States now needs to concentrate on protecting that. And Mr. Trump talks about a golden dome to protect sort of the skies of America, except it would be completely ineffective against this nuclear-powered cruise missile that we've talked about, and probably most other cruise missiles. And he talks about, was it this golden fleet that he's going to build with these massive battleships? And of course, the other thing that's he completely overlooks is America cannot build them. It doesn't have the shipbuilding any longer to build these enormous fleets that he's talking about. America is short of existing air defense missiles. Where is it going to find the industrial capacity in the kind of time frame that Trump wants to build this golden dome that he's talking about? So it's details and nonsense, but it drives policy and people die.
Yeah. So let's see. Tomorrow, Xi and Trump's meeting tomorrow, and what else Trump will come up with after that.
Yeah. So China confirmed the meeting today.
Yeah.
China confirmed the meeting today.
I just saw that.
So they left it right up to the wire. I mean, they did that. That, I'm sure, is intended. I mean, that was to keep Trump and guessing. No, I mean, given that he plays mind games, of course they will play mind games back in return. Good for them.
Yeah. So let's watch. Great.